Now, the Chinese Communist Party-controlled South China Morning Post reports that Chinese scientists have designed a small, low-cost nuclear reactor that would actually be able to drive a swarm of torpedoes across the Pacific Ocean in a week. Australia's once greatest defence, which is distance, is now clearly under threat. So the question is, what are we actually going to do about it? Joining me now is Malcom Davis from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcom, welcome. This concerned me greatly this morning because China are developing arms that they expect to have over the next decade or so, which are remotely drone-controlled torpedoes, effectively nuclear-powered, capable of carrying warheads, while we're messing about deciding how we're going to get submarines to travel from South Australia or from Perth right through around the continent. It's not a good position for us to be in, is it?
No, it's not. And I think what you're seeing is the beginning of a new era in autonomous weapon systems. The Russians have something similar with their Poseidon underwater vehicle that carries a very high yield nuclear warhead, is driven by a nuclear reactor, can travel very long distances. And now the Chinese are following the same path as Moscow, developing these nuclear-powered torpedoes in the Chinese case. These are supposedly conventionally armed. But nevertheless, what it does suggest is that the Chinese and the Russians are working together to develop the new types of autonomous weapons capabilities that can deliver long-range attack with surprise. And we seem to be sitting still and not responding to this challenge. And I think we do need to start thinking about how we defend the country against these sorts of new types of threats.
Yeah, one of the challenges, of course, is that Australia is very reliant on America for its defence needs, and particularly in areas of defence technology. How challenging is that going to be given America's status, both economic, militarily, and I think from a political global leadership status, seems to be on the wane? Is there another alternative for Australia?
Well, look, I wouldn't count America out just yet, but they do have some serious challenges ahead, mainly internally in terms of their domestic political situation and their economy. But militarily, they are still the most powerful and the most technologically advanced armed force on the planet. It should be said, though, that China in particular is starting to erode some of those technological advantages. And so I do think that Australia needs to start thinking about how it can contribute in its own way towards burden sharing with the United States and with other key partners, including Japan, South Korea, India, and Indonesia, towards ultimately building the types of capabilities that can counter and neutralize the threat that is now emerging from China and Russia. So you're quite right. We shouldn't just continue to rely on the United States. We should start to burden share and do some things ourselves.
Yeah, what sort of things should we be doing? I mean, we should be trying to replicate nuclear-powered missiles, or should we be having a nuclear tactical weapons capacity ourselves? These are the serious questions that I think Australia needs to consider. What's your position on that, and what are some other alternative scenarios that we might pursue?
Well, look, I think the issue of Australia getting its own nuclear weapons is probably an extreme scenario, that would only be considered if America essentially dropped off the map and suddenly was no longer a participant in what's known as extended nuclear deterrence. Then I think we would have to start thinking about our options. But we are nowhere near that scenario at this point. What we can do is essentially work towards strengthening US commitments to the Indo-Pacific region, allowing greater US access into Australian military facilities, greater collaboration and cooperation in undertaking joint military operations, and working together towards developing new types of capabilities, such as, for example, hypersonic weapons and also autonomous weapon systems and space capabilities. And I think that's where we really do need to focus on. And AUKUS, that was signed by the Morrison government last year, is a great vehicle to push that agenda forward.
Okay, the Prime Minister today told Sky News it's not in China's interest to keep their sanctions on Australian products. Let me just show the people at home what he said.
Well, it's in China's interest to lift all of the sanctions against Australia, and it's in Australia's interest for that to happen as well. I want to cooperate with China where we can. I'll stand up for Australia's interests where we must. There is no justification for these sanctions on Australian products.
Malcolm, prior to the election, there was a lot of political interest in saying that the Albanese government and his people would be soft on China. How have you viewed how the Prime Minister and his team have stood up to China very early, but so far into their rule in Australia?
Look, they've done a good job as far as I'm concerned. They have not been soft on China. They've actually continued with the Morrison government's approach to responding to the threat posed by China. The Defence Minister, Richard Marles, I think has followed on from Peter Dutton's approach in many respects by recognising that China is a real challenge and a real threat. And so we do need to start thinking about new types of military capability, new force postures. We're having a force posture review in 2023. In foreign policy terms, I think Penny Wong and the Prime Minister Albanese have done a good job in areas such as the Pacific Islands Forum and working with Quad partners and going to NATO. So I am so far quite impressed with the Albanese government's approach to China. But the key thing is they need to hold the course. They need to stand firm. They should not rush to give concessions to China in the hope that that then allows the return to some form of status quo ante that existed prior to 2015. We need to understand that that's never going to happen. The Chinese are implacably determined to challenge us and to assert themselves as a hegemon, and we need to be prepared to respond to that challenge.
I agree with you 100%. Malcolm Davis from ASPI, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the Paul Murray viewers tonight. I really appreciate it.